And, sometimes that'll get a chuckle from people because we all know that there aren't really vampires running around sucking people's blood. It seems as if the whole goal of these encounters is to create this high level of fear in the victim. I think, in fact, that these children are getting what they're setting out to achieve, and that's creating this spike of fear, because in almost all of the encounters, once the person reaches that flight mode and they're, terrified, these kids vanish. It's almost as if mission accomplished. And, that sort of implies to me that these beings, whatever they are feeding off of that emotional energy.
Now, has anybody been physically hurt? Directly? Not
directly by the children, no. There hasn't been any kind of assault. These children are very, it's strange because, they actually hardly move around at all. They just sort of stand there. And in some ways that makes the encounters all the more creepy. There are no accounts of these children trying to barge into a home or force their way in. They just keep repeating these things in a monotone voice. And in fact, some people, report that they believe these children are trying to exert some type of hypnosis or mind control. I had a very interesting account given to me by a woman who had used hypnotherapy to stop smoking. And she told me that when she started seeing the therapist, she actually had a hard time going into a hypnotic state. So it took a little bit of time in working with this therapist. And she said that she had developed a very specific feeling that indicated to her that she was going into a hypnotic state. When she encountered a pair of black-eyed children, when they started speaking and repeating these phrases over and over again, she started to feel that. And of course, it set off, her alarm bells. And she said, "Wait a minute, what's going on here?" Made her all the more frightened. And of course, she got away from these children. But she's convinced that they were trying to exert some type of hypnosis on her.
Any reports of these children reacting with animals, cats, dogs?
Oh, yes.
Oh, boy.
There's a very fascinating account that came out of Texas. It's not in the book because it was, I met this gentleman after the book was already published. This fellow, he comes home from the store. He's walking up to his door. He's got a couple of bags of groceries and has as typical in these accounts. Just as he's opening the door, he suddenly realizes there's a child standing on the ground next to his steps. And this fellow, he turns and he looks at this kid who stares up at him right away and says to this fellow, "Is it food time?" This gentleman was so stunned he couldn't even react. He's just sort of standing there looking at this kid, but he's hearing in the background his pit bull that he raised from a puppy, 3 years old, charging through the house, glances into the door and sees that pit bull charging down the hallway. It's solid wood floors, George. When this dog, tearing down the hall, just snarling and barking, almost reaches the door, he puts the brakes on, and it's literally like a Scooby-Doo cartoon. This dog tumbled over itself onto the steps, got up as quick as it could. This dog was now terrified, tail between his legs, head down, whining, running back in the house, getting away from this kid as quickly as he could.
With no reaction from the kid, I bet.
No. The kid just stood there, start still, repeated his phrase to this man, "I think it's food time. You should invite me in." The pit bull, George, has never been the same since then. This man raised that dog to be a guard dog. He watched it kill rattlesnakes with its teeth. And he had never seen this dog back down from anything. It was terrified just being in the presence of this kid, and it's permanently altered. The dog is just not the same animal anymore.
David, what do these kids wear when they show up?
Most of the reports say that they're wearing a very drab clothing, in tones that are sort of, muted, dark browns, blacks, grays. Occasionally we hear reports where people will say that the clothing looks old-fashioned. I've heard the term Amish repeated a few times, or handmade, or hand-me-down. Ill-fitting clothing we often hear.
And, do they have hair or are they baldish?
No, they have hair.
They do have hair.
Mm-hmm.
Big eyes, pasty-looking, normal kid size.
But here's something else curious, George. No one has ever reported a cell phone, an iPod, a watch. I mean, face it. You go to any place where
every kid has something.
Exactly. They're all wired. They've all got a headset on, or they're texting or something. No, none of these kids have ever been seen with anything like that.
How did this first come about? What were the first early cases about these things?
There's two answers for that. The modern wave of these sightings was sort of instigated in the late 90s. A journalist out of Texas named Brian Bethel posted his encounter with a pair of these black-eyed kids in a parking lot. He posted it on the Internet, and it struck a chord with people. It was the first story, appears to be the first story that was posted on the Internet about these children, and people just really responded to it. Other people started jumping in and saying, oh, my gosh, I've seen something like this. This is what happened to me. And it sort of went through waves since then. I got involved really researching it in the early 2000s, and every couple of years it seems there's another spike in the activity until about the last 3 to 4 years, which it just seems to be nonstop. There are more and more of these accounts all the time. Now, when I was researching for the book, I started digging back and found that there are older accounts. There are some pretty amazing accounts that, go back. There's an amazing one from 1950, and even earlier, accounts that predate the Internet and television and everything else. The trick was that you had to go back and look for these beings under a different guise, because the term black-eyed kid, BEK, black-eyed children, these are the modern phrases we use to describe these beings. What I found when I found older accounts is you had to bear in mind that you needed to look through the cultural lens of the people in the time period as to how they would identify these creatures.
Are there any UFO reports associated with these kids showing up?
Very few.
Okay.
Very, very few. There's a percentage of these accounts that come from people who, claim they are abductees and believe that these children are hybrid beings. I've had people report to me that they've had an encounter with a black-eyed child and they're convinced that it was their hybrid child because, they've been abducted for off and on for 30 years and so forth. But outside of that small little subset of these accounts, no, there's not other paranormal activity, be it UFOs or hauntings or anything else.
Well, you bring up something interesting. I wonder if they're showing up at the home of the mother or father that may have been the donor, and they didn't know that, of course, or whether they're just randomly picking people. What do you think about that?
That's a very curious possibility. It's very strange to me. As I said before, I always look for patterns, and when I first started collecting these accounts, I was a bit befuddled that there just weren't any clear patterns. There's no commonality in the victims. There's nothing that it's a wide range of ethnic background, religious belief, age, and so forth. But what I did find after a time was that there are a large percentage of people who are encountering these children that work in a position of authority. So I have a lot of accounts from law enforcement officers, military personnel, government employees, and it's very interesting. These are often jobs that are high stress, take an incredible amount of time and commitment, and we have to think about how that applies into these encounters, and why those people exactly.
Those that are reporting seeing these black-eyed children, and they leave. Now, you're talking about how some of them vanish, disappear. Do they, like some church people, go door to door, or do they disappear entirely? I mean, have they been known to go to other houses in the
neighborhood?
In the neighborhood,
yeah. No, actually, the accounts are usually very isolated. It will be a situation where they appear to one particular person in the neighborhood, and that's the only time that this type of encounter is ever reported from that general area. I've had an incredible number of reports from people who are witnessing a person who appears completely normal. Sometimes it's someone they've known for, a period of time. They will see the eyes shift to solid black right in front of them.
Shape-shifting.
Yes, you could use that term, although nothing else is changing.
Right.
The facial structure
just
stays
the
the
eyes.
same. Everything else, just the eyes, turn solid black.
You were earlier talking about vampires and vampirism. How does that connect with these kids?
Let me be clear. I'm not saying that I believe these kids are vampires. I think it's very fascinating to look at this from, sort of a folklore perspective, and we have to look at the correlations and try to understand more about this phenomena. Obviously, when you get back into classic, vampire mythos, one of the things that stands out is a vampire traditionally can't enter a household unless he's invited in. And we find that happening with these children. There are no accounts of them entering a home or a car or anything else uninvited, but they try to get that invitation. This comes up time and time again, and that's classic vampire lore. So is this, this weird smell, this disgusting stench that is associated with black-eyed children a percentage of the time. That's something else we find in traditional vampire lore. A lot of people have forgotten some of these things because, the public has gotten fascinated with the sort of sparkly teenage angst vampires, that are all romance centered, and that's not real vampire lore at all. Originally, these were creatures that were literally something that had crawled out of the grave. They were, dead beings that had reanimated, and I think we have to look at the correlations between that lore and some of the things with the black-eyed children.